You're listening to The Art of Procurement, episode 121.
Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, and thanks for listening in to another episode of The Art of Procurement. And my guest today is Drew Polin. Drew is the president of OpDecision, a company that helps organizations reduce their wireless spend, specifically without having to go through really the upheaval of switching out their service providers. If you don't have responsibility for wireless though, I really would encourage you to listen in at least to the beginning of the conversation, because we talk about gain sharing and gain sharing models. And I've always been really wary of the gain sharing model. I actually talk about that in the interview. I think it generally incentivizes the wrong behaviors, kind of going after cost savings at all costs, because that's basically how the gain share is written. But I want you to listen to Drew's thoughts on gain sharing and how he structures his gain share agreements with his clients. I think it's a template that can really be applied in other areas, in other categories. But I'll be honest and say that I actually hesitated to keep this much detail in the final edit from that part of the conversation. When I invite guests on the show, I always make it clear that we're going to talk about the actions, rather than promote the product or the service that my guest may be associated with. And I think the conversation on gain sharing, it touches the line. I wonder if it goes over the line, frankly. But it's through no fault of Drew's. I led him there with my questions. But I decided not to edit it out. And the reason, as I mentioned before, is that it's actually the best gain sharing model that I've seen, because it quickly goes from being gain share to more of a retainer model. So I wanted you to be able to hear how it works as you consider if gain sharing agreements are right for your organization, because it really started to change my mind. In my mind, it was always gain share is a bad thing. After listening to Drew talk, I actually see that there's some nuances, and that it really depends on how the model is structured rather than gain share on its own being something that I wanted to shy away from. And so we then move into wireless, where Drew shares some of the tips and strategies that you can use to make an impact on your wireless spend here in 2017. And a key point that Drew made was that the wireless market, it's so fluid that it's one of those categories where you definitely don't want to sign a deal, put it on the shelf for 3 years, and then just come back to negotiate it, later down the line. Before I roll the tape, one last thing is that today's interview was actually supposed to be one with a CPO as part of my media partnership with Procurement, but we had a last-minute postponement of the recording. It just means that I'm not going to be able to air that interview until probably after the Procurement Indirect East conference has taken place. But I didn't want to lose the opportunity to let you know that if you're interested in attending this year's event, and it's in Orlando in Florida, it's the week of March the 6th, that I do have a 20% discount code just for Art of Procurement listeners. So just head on over to artofprocurement.com/ProcureCon and use the code PI17ART, all one word. So that's artofprocurement.com/ProcureCon again with the code PI17ART, and you'll get 20% discount. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's go straight into the conversation with Drew. So hi there, everybody, and welcome to this week's interview on The Art of Procurement. And today my guest is Drew Polin, the founder and president of OpDecision. So Drew, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you're able to join me. And just for some context, today I think we want to talk about a number of tactics that listeners can use to start managing their wireless expenses in 2017, and actually around the notion of keeping your current provider, so making it as frictionless as possible. But before we go in that direction, we talked a little bit before we recorded about the business model, and there's a number of companies who operate under a similar business model in other areas of spend, and that's gain sharing. I believe from your perspective, it's like zero fee up front, but then you share in the savings as you go on, so it minimizes the risk. But that's something that, to be honest, that model is something I've always been a little bit hesitant of. And, maybe it's just because of some experiences in the past that I've had that haven't worked out so well. So I had a couple of questions around that. And first of all, is how I explained the gain sharing, didn't do a great job of it, but I wanted to see if that's kind of what your perspective on gain sharing is. And then second, what are some tips when you are engaging with a supplier on a gain sharing model that really incentivize the right behaviors to make sure that you're getting the most out of it and that your supplier isn't going to be taking advantage of you?
Gotcha. So that's a great question. So give you a little bit of background. So we, through the initial start of our company, we did begin with a gain share program. And going about 10 years back, I did find it a little bit of a struggle in certain opportunities. And really it kind of harkens back to the landline traditional and telecommunication audits, where there seemed to be a lot of gray area, and a lot of companies engaged in those projects back in the 90s and maybe early 2000s. And due to a lot of the gray and kind of cloudy areas involved on cost savings in the landline space, we did find some hesitancy as we were discussing the mobility, which is a much more black and white savings and savings verification process. So early on, it made for tough conversations and to try to have people separate themselves from some of the bad experiences and, in reality, lawsuits and legal disputes that came out of some of those game share models. We actually used a lot of that feedback to help kind of tweak our model to really avoid those types of situations. Yeah. So one of the first things that I did was I actually interviewed a lot of different CFOs on our billing structure and model for gain share. And one of the biggest frustrations they had is when they sometimes transitioned into a new company and found that a gain share model was in place. It was a 2, 3, 5-year model.
Right.
They had no familiarity with the project. They had very little weight to do a verification process, and ultimately that didn't end well. So for us, we realized that gain share was we felt a very fair way to be compensated, creates motivation on both sides to kind of leverage everything as possible to reduce expenses, but to make things as transparent as possible. So the first thing we came up with was to go with a model that we felt would be palatable, which is essentially a third of the first year of savings, or 33.3%, and have it be a finite period of time. Number two, most of our clients pay us the first 4 months of savings as we verify it, so we have no upfront costs. And also built into our contract, it's only a 3-page agreement, and the third page is strictly identifying how do I establish the baseline together, how we do the monthly savings verifications, and then also providing illustrations to provide additional background and visibility to the client. So when we're signing off on the agreement together, we've been completely transparent on how we address the baseline spend, how we do the monthly savings verification, and it's something that OpDecision and the client has agreed on entering into the agreement. So really, we find that takes a lot of the potential conflict out of the possibility, throughout the engagement together. The other thing that we do is, because most of our clients do pay the first 4 months of savings, we are engaged with our customer for 8 months after we implement the solution. So for an equal amount of time that we're being compensated, we're providing an additional 4 months with no additional fees, where we're providing that additional savings verification for the customer.
Yeah.
So that also provides a peace of mind where they're getting a fully detailed analytical review of their cellular vendors and expenses on a monthly basis for each of the 8 months, and provides us something to go back to that's easily trackable, that verifies the savings based off the metrics and the information that we provide in the contracts. One of the recent changes that we've provided is we also offer 50% of savings for each of the 8 months that we're engaged. So it's another model that we've kind of included into our offering for financial revenue share in the past couple of years, and that gives a client the ability to be able to stretch out the payment over each of those 8 months. So that's some of the additional background there. The final thing I think that would be helpful is, once we share with the client what the final savings will be based off an approval process, which I can maybe address a little bit later in the interview, we cap our fee at that final savings figure. And usually over the next 8 months, especially in today's market with rates changing so quickly, new feature options becoming available, we're typically exceeding savings that we project for our clients, usually about 30% or a third through the project. and we do not charge anything extra for additional savings that we generate for our customer. So that usually helps create some warm and fuzzy feelings, and we're demonstrating additional value to the client, and that's some of the background that may be helpful for you to kind of understand on why we really don't come across questions or issues when we're doing that savings verification and invoicing to the customer.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there too that I wanted to highlight. One is the fact that you have the baseline and the savings methodology up front, so that there's not as much argument, because that's one of the things I would always struggle with, is that there would always be, you'd see argument over what was a saving, what wasn't a saving. I think the fact that it's shorter term, so, you talked about a 4 and 8 month project. It's not that you're going in for 3 years. And another kind of thing I would advise anyone who's looking at gainshare models is make sure that, well, one, I wouldn't advise it to be a multi-year deal. The second thing, though, is if it is, make sure the baseline resets. So one of the issues that you always have is that the baseline may be like the day one baseline, and 3 years later, your provider may only be saving you 1 or 2%, but they're still using the baseline from 3 years ago to calculate the savings of the gain share. The other thing is, I think that in situations like, I was always concerned about incentivizing the wrong behaviors. The fact that that this is all really based around saving money from your existing supply base is something that takes away some of that friction, because you're not, trying to force an organization into changing their suppliers for the basis, basically, or the benefit of saving money. You're doing it within their existing supply base structure. So that reduces a lot of the change that would be associated, but also means that you got to do it in a way that maintains the relationship with that incumbent.
Absolutely. And what it also does is it avoids double dipping. So there are organizations out in the marketplace that they're being compensated based off savings, and they're doing that by promoting a change of vendor and negotiating new contracts. But what's often not disclosed is that company is being compensated by that new vendor as well.
Yeah.
So sometimes that also muddies the waters a little bit, where you're not sure where their intentions lie. Are they representing the customer, or are they representing their own firm to bring as much revenue as possible?
Right.
So we've eliminated that from our model. We do not sell service. We do not represent any vendor. And we also found that has taken a lot of potential conflict out of that. The last thing that I would suggest is you're kind of providing tips out there is with every single project that we do, we are presenting all of the cost savings opportunities to the customer, but the only heavy lifting we really have a client engaging on throughout this project is an approval process that I referenced a little bit earlier. And what that is we give the client the right to approve or reject any recommendation for any reason, and they don't have to give us a reason.
Yeah.
The only thing that we're asking is they don't implement that on their own without us.
Right.
And what that does is give the client complete control, where they're signing off on every single line item that's going to contribute to change and cost savings. And then it also prevents us from taking credit for something that they feel that we should not take credit for. So I find that process is actually one of the most, if not the most important of our process with our client, because everything that we're going forward with, they have agreed is something that they would like put into place, and it has a quantifiable savings associated with it.
Yeah.
And everything that they've rejected is removed from the savings proposal and the final plan, and that way there's no conflict or issues on distinguishing what we've put into place and the client has signed off of versus what we're trying to take savings for that maybe the client didn't feel comfortable putting into place.
Yeah, the strategy is aligned with the client. You're not going off and doing something on your own.
Yeah, we also give the client the ability to reject 100% of our recommendations. And we have a minimum guarantee of 10% that we need to generate. And in that approval process, if we fall short of 10% after approvals, we give the client the right to terminate the contract with no cost associated with any of the work that we do. So we felt giving as much control to the customer as possible really helped alleviate a lot of the concerns or issues with the gain share or shared revenue-based model.
All right, so what I want to do next is I want to talk a little bit about some of the tactics and tips for managing wireless spend, as we look at 2017, based on some of the things that you're seeing in the market right now. But before I do that, and maybe this is just, a little bit of a 101 level, what to you constitutes what wireless spend is? So, what's the different spend categories that would fall under wireless as a category?
Great question. So today, there are more areas than there would be a couple of years ago.
Right.
So it used to be just basic cell phones, which are still out there for some organizations. You have smartphones, so anything ranging from iPhones to Droids to other types of, BlackBerry's still out there in technologies. We're paying for a voice and data plan. Then you have tablets. That's been an area of a huge proliferation over the past several years, where you have Galaxy tablets, iPads, and those types of applications out in the marketplace. And a lot of those are going through the mobile networks and not just leveraging Wi-Fi.
Right.
MiFis are another technology. So MiFis used to be known as air cards. So something that you can use as a hotspot to go through your computer through a cell phone network. These days, I'm starting to see the MiFi population dwindle a little bit because you can use your phone as a hotspot.
Right.
And most plans include that feature, so you're not having to pay extra.
Yeah.
Those devices tend to also get lost a lot more frequently when we're doing analysis.
Been there, done that.
For no usage history, we find those devices tend to have the highest level of no activity.
Yeah.
And then the one that we're seeing really become more active in the market, and I'm expecting to become even larger as every year passes, is what's called machine-to-machine technology, which also can show up on your cell phone bill. And we're finding everything from parking meter companies to utility companies for their pipes and for their meters. There's mobile technology that's proliferated throughout the technology segment where these types of services are running through a mobile network for day-to-day usage for businesses. We've seen everything from cellular technology being planted into a heart monitor device to a company that was one of those car share type organizations where it was literally a SIM chip through the cell phone network that managed the reservation system, was actually able to unlock the car door, start the car. Those are some of the types of interesting applications we see going through mobility, and that all tends to fall under a category called machine-to-machine.
Interesting. I've not even heard of that category, and so it makes me think of, and I know this is a very broad kind of label, but the notion of the Internet of Things. So as machines are all talking to each other, it's the way of transmitting that data, I guess.
It's a new way that they found that they could reduce their costs by not having hard wire lines run to them, but also things that aren't tethered to a wall. You can have out, in the marketplace and, use actually really small amounts of data. So a lot of those rate plans probably average around $10. And the reason why it's been a big area for cost savings is we do have access to our benchmarks and custom pricing and unique ways to look at it, where sometimes we can get it as low as, $3 to $5 per line per user. And organizations using the machine-to-machine technology, typically they have hundreds to thousands of these things out in the marketplace because it's become embedded in their technology or their solution. So that's why it's become a really big area for savings that we never used to really look at before, but is becoming very relevant.
Yes, there's more devices or chips or whatever it may be that are carrying the technology out there.
Yeah, I'll give you one quick example that kind of blew me away. We just brought on a client that's a banking institution with 16,000 lines of service. We were surprised to find about 14,000 of them were actually ATM machines.
Right.
So they had mobile technology in there as a fail-safe backup in case the landline services went out. Their machines could still work and people could still pull out their money. And that was an interesting application that I didn't even realize was out in the market yet.
So from a spend perspective, is it still voice and data that's overwhelmingly, makes up the majority of spend in the categories, and then the hardware being the smartphones really and the tablets?
That's a great question. So the really quick progression is the carriers used to make their money on voice when I started my career probably about 14 years ago. Then I felt for a period of time it was really text messaging. So voice became pretty commoditized, and then text messaging became a profit center. In today's market, I find most organizations and even consumers have unlimited voice and text. So you're paying a pretty fair rate for those abilities. And now the profit center is based around data and data consumption. And that's what we see as the biggest pain point in the market for both managing as well as costs associated with it. And then the last thing is international expenses. So one of the top pain points that we found for all of our clients that did business internationally up until about a year ago was international expenses And that's probably the area that the market's changing the fastest,
Right.
where we're actually seeing a very steep decline. And one vendor specifically that's behind one of their major competitors, we have some background that we're expecting a major launch of a new global reduction feature that's going to be pretty revolutionary and probably cut about 60-70% of the expense on international communication for travelers. That's been an interesting area that we've seen that pain point be attacked.
Yep.
And we're starting to see a pretty significant reduction in expense associated with that.
Interesting. And, you know, being a Brit living in the States, having most of my family in the UK, I've certainly suffered from the cost of international phone calls, and actually why, you know, using Skype at free is certainly a better alternative than even texting. And I've often thought that, you know, part of it's due to competition, but part of it's due to regulation as well, and that the regulators are trying to open up the market and trying to reduce some of the monopolies maybe that's out there in terms of the pricing on international. Is it the reduction in costs that you say coming, is it a regulatory or because of regulatory pressure, or is it just truly due to the competitor in the marketplace who's going to be looking at international in a different way that will then end up driving the market down?
Really what I find is it's become a global world, right?
Yeah.
So it used to be everything was focused on the country that you're in, but in every area of life, those walls seem to be coming down, and mobility is included in that. So really, to answer your question specifically, there was one vendor, T-Mobile, that was the first to address the insanely expensive cost of international travel for voice data and text, and they were the first one to come out with a price point that was incredibly aggressive. It is important to point out, you know, T-Mobile was owned by Deutsche Telekom when they launched this, so they already had, you know, an international infrastructure, roaming agreements, etc. So I feel that started to put some pressure on AT&T and Verizon, where we see a majority of the business market using those two vendors today out of the U.S. Mm-hmm. And then Verizon was the first one to react, to come out with a very aggressive price point that I actually feel is better than T-Mobile's, which was kind of a shock. And again, based off the research we're doing, my understanding is AT&T is going to follow suit pretty shortly. So I would say it's less about the pressure from the consumers because it's something in the businesses. It's something they've been dealing with for a long time, and the reality is it is what it is. But once one of the vendors makes a turn in the market and does something unique, the other ones start to feel the pressure to follow suit to recapture or keep their market share of global travelers.
Yeah, and there's never any incentive for AT&T and Verizon to be the leader, really, because they already have such a large portion of the market. So for T-Mobile, it's something for them to increase their market share that the others have to respond and react to.
They have to respond, but in due time. Again, in the business market, we find Verizon and AT&T typically don't care what Sprint or T-Mobile are doing. They tend to focus on each other. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a reality that we've seen. So there was a long lead time before Verizon came out with their option. That was super aggressive. And AT&T, frankly, has taken much longer than I expected to counter Verizon. Right. AT&T's prices, although they were aggressive when they came out several years ago with their international program, when you put them side by side, it's like night and day on expenses today. But again, that's about to change very, very quickly in the near future.
So what are some of the challenges then in keeping spend under control?
So I'm laughing because it used to be around managing users' voice and data consumption. Voice and text messaging consumption and having the right price points and plans. Now we're finding everything is revolving around data, and not only having the right size plans for their accounts, but really putting in policies. And we're finding that our goal and our niche is reducing costs for customers, and we're finding to be able to assist them to hit those needs and to create some organic cost reduction is giving them visibility on usage behavior patterns of percentages of their user base that clearly are not using their devices for business purposes.
Right.
So what I mean by that, I've had one user that had over 650 gigabytes of activity on one bill cycle. And just to give you an example, I have some clients with 1,000 lines of service that as an entire account does not use 650 gigabytes.
Right.
people are using their devices as almost a hub for their home entertainment systems, their television, their cable. They're using Netflix.
Right.
Streaming has been very destructive to the business community for managing their business-based services, because now today, personal and business tends to bleed together, and people are using their devices on how they want to use it for personal pleasure and entertainment, and that's affecting companies' bottom line. So the reason why I went off on that tangent is part of what we're advising clients on is we cannot control individual user behavior. Right. We need to work around it, but through the reporting modules we provide the clients, through high data usage reports where we point out those individuals and their patterns, we're at least sharing with clients how they can use that information to address these things with, we call them rogue users or abusers, but also to craft policy statements that they need to update, and they need to inform their user base on what they're allowed to use their device for and what they're not allowed to use their device for, so they can clamp down on some of these things that are costing some of these organizations significant amounts of money. Right. So really not only managing the plans to accommodate the data activity of the user base, but managing the employee base and having a policy that's enforceable and that has repercussions if somebody is not following that protocol. That's become very important in today's market.
It seems like compliance is as important as having the right plans almost, because you can have great plans, but if somebody's still watching Netflix 24/7, then you're still going to be spending more money than you would if they didn't have access to Netflix.
Absolutely, and some of it is using the tools that the vendors are providing. So I'm still shocked every time we review an account, we see significant data overages over a 3-month period. I can understand on a 1-month period, because it only takes 1 or 2 or 3 users to totally change the dynamic of your data pool, depending on the size of your organization and how much of a buffer you give yourself. Right. But part of what the carriers do provide today as resources is real-time alerts that tell you when you've used 50, 75, 90, and 100% of your data pool, which gives you an opportunity to react and adjust your pool to avoid usage charges. And that's something that we think companies really need to leverage those resources more aggressively in managing their own accounts instead of just deleting or overlooking those emails to avoid some of those cost triggers from taking place.
So more of a proactive approach to managing the usage on a month-by-month basis then.
Exactly. And you can even take a look at your account in real time. So every time we receive those alerts in regards to a client's account, we'll pull a usage report. We'll see if there's any user that's had a major change in behavior, bring that to the client's attention. Also gives us the opportunity to identify if we need to increase the size of the pool to mitigate or eliminate the issue from happening. So we used to do a monthly bill review and be able to react and help the client, correct issues going forward. Now we're finding we're more engaged on a day-to-day basis, leveraging this real-time information to prevent issues from even occurring throughout that 8-month engagement that we have with our customers.
Can you block, at the source almost certain websites? So you know that certain websites are fueling a lot of traffic that's not related to business use. Is there a way of just stopping access across the entire network to those sites?
Depending on the types of solutions that you're leveraging. So one of the things out in the marketplace is called MDM, or mobile device management. So we do see most enterprise organizations and a lot of mid-sized organizations leveraging these types of tools and resources. The issue is it's not typically being managed on a carrier network level. It's being managed from kind of an internal policies and procedures and standpoint where you're trying to block certain areas. The issues we find is technologically you have a much more advanced user base out there that a lot of them have grown up with technology and they've figured out ways around some of these management solutions. We also find every MDM solution, not every, but most, there are certain areas that they can't manage or block 100%. And some of the issues we see is with the BYOD programs, you only have so much control over it as well if you haven't been able to implement your MDM solution onto their device or kind of force that issue. So there are mechanisms out there that can do it. Speaking honestly, most accounts we review that have MDM solutions, we still see a majority of the same data issues that we see with organizations that don't have those things in place.
Okay. So it's not that they're necessarily overly effective at kind of doing what you want them to do, at least in blocking some of the high use or high risk sites and reducing some of your spend by doing that through compliance.
Yeah, there's definitely ways to do it, and some companies have been effective, but we definitely see some holes in managing that entirely.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we've done over the past few years is we've demoed a lot of third-party solutions and apps on managing data and putting more of kind of a vice grip on what they can and cannot access. But we have yet to find a perfect solution, and let me rephrase that, a perfect solution that's priced appropriately.
Right.
Because, for example, one of the vendors just rolled out a solution that has a $5 cost per user, but if you have 3,000 lines of service, you're now paying $15,000. Ultimately, for the ability to try to control data, well, if the account's managed properly, worst case scenario, maybe you have to spend a couple extra thousand on a monthly basis to avoid having usage or overcharges and really make sure you have a predictable cost. And then you kind of put that side by side on what you're spending for the solution to prevent that from happening. The price point just really isn't palatable where it makes sense to integrate that type of thing in the market for an organization. At least that's what we're finding today. We did find a solution that was $1 per user price point, but part of the reason why we test things out is we found the implementation process was a nightmare.
Right.
And our focus is based around cost savings, although we help clients in other areas. We also found for some of these third-party solutions, you could only use published rates that were kind of out in the market openly with the vendors with these types of solutions, which really took away a lot of our cost-saving measures, which also made it less than desirable to really kind of refer out or leverage those types of tools as well.
So as we start to wrap up then, Drew, I have one last question, and that's, you obviously see a lot of clients, you see a lot of prospects. What is it that you wish that, or you would recommend that some of your clients or prospects would do to just get a little bit of a better handle on managing their wireless spend, and not necessarily, in the day-to-day, but when they're looking out at wireless as a strategy, what are they missing?
That's a great question. So the biggest misnomer I probably see out in the marketplace today is based around the contract negotiation.
Okay.
So when we're talking to potential clients, we find that they typically take the position that they just negotiated an aggressive contract, that their procurement team and technology team are involved, and they're good to go, they're in great shape, there's nothing we can do to help, they got the best agreement, the largest discount.
Mm-hmm.
So what we find in reality is in today's market, the market changes so quickly that even when we work with a client that negotiated maybe the best contract we've ever seen 6 months before, we find the contract is really just one small piece of the puzzle. In reality, the rates and the structures and the options in the market are changing so quickly that typically we find if we're working with somebody who signed an agreement 6 months ago, the rates and the types of reduction recommendations we're making to them today are something that are not built into their agreements and not something that they have to negotiate for, which also is another kind of misnomer that we see out in the market. Well, how do we know we can use these things if we're not in our contract?
Right.
Well, a lot of the rates we use, even if we call them unpublished or specialty, we call them that because we've identified them in the market and they're not openly advertised or published or shared by the vendors, but they're not something you need to negotiate for and you can take advantage of any time. So where I'm going with this is what we recommend is that a client keeps in consistent communication with their account representative, push them for more information, push them for more options. For example, one of the vendors may have 6 different rate structures for the business market. Typically, their internal reporting systems and the rate plan analysis tools will only show you 1 or 2 rate structure options. So one of the things we suggest is ask for more.
Right.
Even if you say maybe you feel this is not a fit, I'd still like to see what all my options are and kind of weigh the pros and cons.
Yeah.
And by pushing for that additional information, they may start getting exposed to what we call unpublished and specialty pricing, where you don't have to negotiate or build it into your agreement, but you can leverage some of the things, for example, that may become available a week or 2 before that didn't even exist before. And that's one of the things that I would highly encourage is almost on a monthly basis, be requesting information, ask questions, let them know some of the pain points that you're feeling today. And sometimes you might be surprised on the responses or what they may share is coming out, next quarter or the next week or whatever it may be.
That's interesting. So don't sign a contract and then put it on the shelf for 2 or 3 years until it's up for renewal.
Absolutely. I mean, we have clients that literally have signed contracts 3 weeks before we're engaged.
Right.
And we're still coming in and cutting 20-25%. And it's not by raising the discount level. It's just by using unique rate structures and rate options that the carrier just didn't expose them to.
Mm-hmm. So what I'd just like to ask, one final question. This is the easy question. Where can listeners find out a little bit more? Where can they contact you if they'd like to talk a little bit more in a little bit more depth about wireless?
Sure. So I do have a LinkedIn profile, which is under Drew Polin, Polin.
Yep.
Company name is OpDecision, and that's spelled O, P as in Peter, and then the word decision, Decision. And I can be found on LinkedIn that way. Our website is also opdecision.com.
Mm-hmm.
On there, we provide an overview of our services, case studies, testimonial letters, client examples. We also have some white papers and some other industry information that can be helpful. And we also have a contact option on the website as well. So if anybody's interested in having a conversation, discussing maybe their current situation or anything that they think would be relevant to discuss together, we can be contacted that way as well. And that's something that you would typically get a response within 24 hours from us.
Great. Well, what I'll do is I will provide links to all those different references in the show notes for today's episode. That's going to be at artofprocurement.com/wireless2017. That's wireless 2017, or one word. And Drew, just one last time, thank you very much for your time today and for sharing some of the ins and outs of managing wireless here in 2017.
Problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.